The enchanted ceiling of the great hall had been showing a calm autumn evening when Harry first sat down to dinner. Wisps of cloud drifted across a deepening blue sky, and one or two early stars had begun to appear, faint and steady. Harry had just reached for the shepherd's pie when Hermione's fork slipped from her fingers and clinked against her plate. "That's not right," she said, staring upward. Ron paused mid-chew and followed her gaze. "What's not right? Looks normal to me." "It was clear 5 minutes ago," Hermione replied. "Now, look." Harry tilted his head back. Hermione was right. The sky overhead had changed with unsettling speed. Heavy grey clouds churned across the ceiling, rolling and thickening as they watched. The warm hum of dinner seemed to dim around the edges. The temperature in the hall dropped enough that students near the doors pulled their robes closer. "Blimey," Ron said. "That's moving fast." Professor Flitwick stood on his chair at the staff table, peering up with bright interest. "Fascinating. The ceiling is responding beautifully. There must be quite a storm system moving in." As if the words had been a cue, the first snowflakes appeared against the enchanted sky. Big flakes, slow at first, then more of them, swirling as though caught in invisible gusts. Younger students gasped and pointed, delighted by the sudden winter above their heads. A Ravenclaw third year leaned toward her friend. "I've never seen it change that quickly before." Hermione was already drawing her wand. She murmured a quick spell under her breath, then nodded as if confirming something she had suspected. "It's real," she said. "There's a blizzard starting outside. The ceiling isn't exaggerating." "If anything, it's understating it." Ron blinked. "How can you understate a blizzard?" "The ceiling shows the general weather," Hermione said, brisk and practical, "but it can't fully capture the wind speed or the temperature. We'll want to get back to the tower sooner rather than later." Harry glanced toward the tall windows that rose like dark mirrors along the walls. Snow had already begun to streak past them at an angle, fast enough to suggest strong wind. The light outside had taken on that strange grey-white quality that always came with heavy snowfall. "Think we should skip pudding?" Harry asked, only half serious. Ron looked genuinely wounded. "But there's treacle tart. We can ask the house elves for something later," Hermione said, standing and gathering her bag. "Come on. I'd rather not be caught wandering the corridors when this really starts." The great hall buzzed with weather-related chatter now. Professors watched the ceiling with a kind of professional curiosity. Students leaned toward the windows, trying to glimpse the grounds. As they headed toward the doors, Harry caught Professor McGonagall's eye. She looked tired but alert, and she gave them the smallest nod of approval. "Sensible students," her expression said. "Students who did not wait until the castle was full of draughts and slippery stones." Percy Weasley was already on his feet, collecting the younger Gryffindors with an air of importance. "First and second years with me," he announced. "We're heading straight to the tower. No dawdling." The entrance hall felt colder than the Great Hall, as though the storm had reached through the walls and touched the stone. For a moment they considered taking the shortcut across the courtyard. But when the great oak doors opened, the wind hit them hard enough to make Harry stagger. Snow was falling in earnest now, swirling in thick, fast patterns. It was not the gentle kind of snow that drifted politely to the ground. This was driven, sharp, impatient. Ron lifted his voice. "Forget the courtyard. Long way round." They ducked back inside and took the interior route. Other students had come to the same conclusion. The corridors were more crowded than usual for this time of evening, filled with robes and hurried footsteps, everyone moving with purpose toward common rooms and dormitories. Bad weather at Hogwarts meant something different than it did in the outside world. Here, the castle's ancient magic interacted with storms in ways that could be fascinating if you were safely inside. Two Hufflepuff girls hurried past them, cheeks pink, eyes bright. Did you see the snow through the charms corridor windows? It's already piling up. As they climbed, the castle itself seemed to change. The stone walls carried a deeper chill than usual, and the torches burned with a restless flicker. Every window they passed showed the storm growing wilder. Snow built against the glass in pale drifts. Wind pressed and pulled at the world outside. Even through thick panes, the weather looked loud. "The castle is sealing itself up," Hermione said, pausing at a window. "Watch." They stood and watched as frost began creeping across the glass in delicate patterns, branching like lace. It looked almost deliberate, as though the ice were drawing its own designs. "The gaps around the frame tighten," Hermione added, her voice warmed by that familiar academic excitement. "The stone itself shifts, very slightly." "Hogwarts does that?" Harry asked. "Protection charms built into the foundation," Hermione said. "The castle has stood for over 1,000 years. It knows how to weather a storm, literally." They climbed towards the 7th floor, passing portraits whose occupants had abandoned their frames, apparently seeking better shelter or a better view. Sir Cadogan's frame stood empty, but his plump pony remained inside, calm and unimpressed by the entire situation. By the time they reached the portrait of the fat lady, snow was visible through every window they passed. The temperature had dropped far enough that Harry could see his breath in pale little clouds. The fat lady was wrapped in a painted shawl, looking distinctly displeased. "About time," she said as they approached. "The draft up here is dreadful. Simply dreadful." "Sorry," Hermione said, automatically. "We came as quickly as we could." "The password, still." Yes, I know what the password is," the fat lady interrupted. "You needn't remind me." She sniffed. "Fortuna Major. Terms as," though why they couldn't have chosen something more elegant, I'll never know. The portrait swung open, and warmth spilled out like a welcome. They stepped into the Gryffindor common room and immediately felt their shoulders relax. The fire was roaring, as if it had been tended only moments ago. Scarlet and gold hangings glowed in the flickering light, and the familiar circular space felt like a sanctuary against the weather pressing at the castle walls. The room was crowded. It seemed most of Gryffindor had decided to spend the evening here, rather than in the library or their dormitories. Younger students claimed the spots closest to the fire, and were already absorbed in a card game that involved excited voices and quick hands. Older students clustered in groups, talking over homework and gossip, and occasionally glancing toward the windows as if the storm might perform something new. Fred and George were near one of the windows, pressing close to the glass and making dramatic faces at the white chaos outside. A small group had gathered around them, laughing. "Oi, Harry," Fred called when he spotted them. "Come look at this." They moved over, weaving between armchairs and knees and scattered bags. The view from the tower was spectacular and slightly alarming. Snow fell so heavily that the grounds below were nearly invisible, reduced to a shifting mass of white. The wind drove flakes sideways in relentless streams. Drifts were already building against the castle walls like pale waves. "Hasn't been a storm like this in years," George said cheerfully. "Not since our second year. And that one didn't properly get going until midnight. This is quality blizzard material." "Ah." "This is classes might be cancelled tomorrow material," Fred added with hope. Ron squinted at the storm. "I remember that one McGonagall couldn't even get the Transfiguration corridor doors open." "How does snow get inside the castle?" Harry asked, watching the way it piled against stone ledges outside. Usually it doesn't, Hermione said. But in really severe storms, some of the older sections have tiny gaps in the stones. Courtyards fill up, the snow drifts, and it can creep into connecting corridors. The house elves usually deal with it overnight. Poor house elves, Ron said. Busy night for them. They left the twins to their storm watching and found their favorite spot by the fireplace. 3 worn armchairs that had been claimed by generations of Gryffindors and had achieved the perfect level of comfortable shabbiness. Harry sank into his chair with relief. The warmth from the fire soaked into him, and for a moment he just sat there, letting the day's tension slip away. The common room settled into a cozy rhythm. The first excitement about the storm faded into a quieter contentment at being safely inside. Conversations hummed around them, blending into a soft background of voices. A group of 7th years argued over parchment in one corner, deep in some complicated subject that made Hermione's fingers twitch as if she wanted to join in. Percy appeared near the staircase, looking flustered. "Has anyone seen my prefect notes?" Percy demanded. "I had them at dinner and now they're gone." "You probably ate them with your potatoes," Ron muttered, just under his breath. Hermione elbowed him, but she was smiling. The portrait hole opened again, letting in a brief breath of cold air as the last stragglers arrived from dinner. Neville climbed through, looking as though he'd been outdoors, despite having stayed inside the whole time. "The corridor outside is freezing," Neville announced to no one in particular. Nearly headless Nick was complaining about it. He said, "Even he can feel the cold, and he's been dead for hundreds of years." As if summoned by the mention, nearly headless Nick drifted through the wall near the fireplace. Students closest to him shivered and shifted slightly away. Nick always brought a faint chill with him, like a memory of winter. "Quite the storm," Nick said conversationally, floating toward the window to look out. His head wobbled precariously as he turned. "Reminds me of the winter of 1512. Now that was a blizzard. We were snowed in for weeks. The castle had to resort to some very creative magic to keep the fires going. Weeks." Her first year squeaked near the hearth. "Oh, don't worry, my dear," Nick said kindly. "The house elves are much better organized these days, and the warming charms are far more sophisticated. We'll all be quite comfortable. Still, it might be wise to stay close to your common rooms for the next day or so. The castle does odd things in weather like this." "Odd things?" Harry asked. "The magic gets stirred up," Nick said. "Nothing dangerous, just unpredictable. Staircases may change more frequently than usual. Portraits become more talkative. That sort of thing." He drifted upward as he spoke, and then, with a polite nod, moved on through the wall and away, leaving behind that lingering cold. Ron stretched his legs toward the fire. Mental, isn't it? That storms can affect magic. "Everything affects magic," Hermione said. "Weather, emotions, lunar phases, the age of the stones. Magic isn't separate from the world. It's woven through it. That's why places like Hogwarts feel so different from ordinary buildings. Centuries of magic soaked into every wall. Amen. Target. Fu." Harry listened, letting Hermione's words wash over him. But his attention was caught by movement near his feet. Crookshanks had appeared from somewhere and was stalking across the rug with fierce purpose. The ginger cat's squashed face was fixed on the window. Despite the glass being closed, 1 or 2 stubborn snowflakes had slipped inside and were drifting lazily down, carried by warm air currents. "Crookshanks, no," Hermione began. But the cat had already launched himself at a particularly large flake. His paw struck it mid-air with surprising accuracy. The snow vanished at the touch, and Crookshanks landed with the satisfied look of a creature who believed he had saved the entire common room from invasion. Ron stared. "How are snowflakes getting in?" "I thought you said the castle seals up." "It does," Hermione said, watching her cat with fond exasperation. "But the common rooms are warm, so there's always some circulation, and old castles settle and breathe very slightly. The fat lady's frame probably has tiny gaps, too. It's part of the magic." Crookshanks settled near the fire, apparently appointed as guardian against further snowflake incursions. His yellow eyes tracked every pale speck that drifted within sight. Time passed in that gentle way it sometimes did at Hogwarts, when no one was rushing toward danger or exams. Younger students were sent to bed by Percy, who took his prefect duties very seriously when Fred and George were not distracting him. The seventh years eventually collected their parchments and climbed the stairs, still arguing quietly. By 9 o'clock, the common room had quieted. Perhaps 20 students remained, most absorbed in homework or murmured conversations. Outside, the storm intensified. When Harry glanced at the windows, he could see only swirling white beyond the glass. The wind pressed against the tower in steady waves, a constant presence rather than an occasional interruption. Ron reached into his robes and produced his battered wizard's chess set. The pieces were chipped and worn, the kind of set that had survived years of Weasley ownership and considered itself tough because of it. "Fancy a game?" Ron asked. "You'll just beat me," Harry replied. "Probably," Ron said cheerfully, arranging the board on the low table between them. "But that's no reason not to play." Harry pulled his chair closer anyway. Hermione conjured a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, then sat with a book balanced on her knees, glancing up now and then to watch the board. As Ron set the pieces, they grumbled at being called into service again. The White Queen lifted her stone chin and looked Harry over with unmistakable judgment. "Try to put up a decent fight this time," she said. Harry couldn't help it. He smiled. For a moment, with Ron leaning forward in concentration, and Hermione settled beside them in the firelight, the storm outside felt very far away. The castle held steady. The common room breathed warmth. The world beyond the windows could do what it liked. Here, in the heart of Gryffindor Tower, Harry felt something rare and quiet settle in his chest. He felt, simply and undeniably, like he was home. Ron cracked his knuckles with the seriousness of someone about to lead troops into battle. "Right then," he said. "Your move, Harry." Harry pushed a pawn forward. The piece trudged into place with visible reluctance, glancing back as if already regretting its decision. "Defensive," the White Queen muttered, not bothering to lower her voice. "This will be over quickly." Hermione let out a quiet laugh and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "I'll referee. Someone needs to make sure Ron doesn't cheat." "Have faith in her." "I never cheat," Ron said, moving his knight. The stone horse galloped across the board with energetic confidence. "You told your knight to trip my bishop last time," Hermione replied. "That wasn't cheating," Ron said, unrepentant. "That was creative strategy." Their bickering settled into the comfortable rhythm Harry had come to rely on. The firelight flickered across the room, warm and steady, and the storm outside became a distant presence, like a problem that belonged to another world. A cold draught brushed the back of Harry's neck as the portrait hole opened again. The fat lady's voice carried in from the corridor. "Hurry up. You're letting all the warmth out." 3 fifth-year girls climbed through, their hair slightly damp and their robes dusted with melting snow despite having been indoors. The tallest shook out her cloak and looked toward the fire with relief. "It's mad out there," she said. The corridor near the astronomy tower is freezing. Should have stayed here, her friend replied, heading straight for the nearest chair. Hermione's head lifted sharply. Astronomy tower? The girl nodded. Professor Sinistra's put a notice up. No class tonight. Hermione stared, as if personally offended by the idea. She never cancels. Ron captured one of Harry's pawns and shrugged. Can't see stars through a blizzard. Even magical telescopes have limits. Harry tried to focus on the game, but the window behind Ron's head held his attention. Snow swirled beyond the frosted glass in hypnotic, shifting patterns. The curtains moved faintly, even though they were drawn, as if the storm had found a way to touch the room without entering it. Harry, Ron said, waving a hand in front of his face. You planning to move sometime this century? Sorry, Harry said, forcing himself to look down at the board. It already looked grim. Ron's pieces advanced in confident formation, while Harry's scattered defenders tried to pretend they had a plan. Harry moved his bishop and immediately regretted it. The bishop slid into place and groaned. Oh, brilliant. Right in the firing line. Ron's rook moved next, thundering across the board with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested it enjoyed its job far too much. The bishop was promptly knocked aside and dragged off the board, complaining the entire way. Harry had been shocked by wizard chess the first time he'd played. Pieces didn't simply disappear. They argued. They sulked. They fought with real impact. But by now he'd grown used to it. The pieces always reformed later, ready to throw themselves into battle again as if nothing had happened. You're not even trying, Ron accused, though his grin gave him away. I am trying, Harry said. You're just too good. Ron leaned back with exaggerated pride. Finally, someone who appreciates my talents. Hermione rolled her eyes but smiled. Try thinking more than one move ahead, Harry. I am thinking ahead, Harry said. I'm thinking about how quickly Ron is going to checkmate me. A portrait on the wall leaned forward in its frame. A wizard in elaborate robes, hair tied back in a ribbon, regarded the chessboard with the air of someone assessing a failed architectural project. The boy's not wrong, the portrait said. Dreadful positioning. Reminds me of the time Lord Peverton challenged Sir Barnaby. Lost his entire left flank in 4 moves. Gods, thank you, Harry said dryly. Just offering historical perspective, the portrait replied, settling back as if he'd done his civic duty. The common room grew quieter as time passed. Students trickled upstairs in small groups, voices fading as they climbed. Percy had stopped trying to look like he was on patrol, and was now tucked into a corner with parchment, probably writing to Penelope Clearwater with intense concentration. Across the room, a cluster of 6th years played a complicated card game that seemed to involve strategy, whispered negotiations, and the occasional burst of colored smoke that vanished quickly. Hermione watched it once, lips tightening, then returned to her book as if reminding herself that some things were not worth investigating. I'm cold, Hermione said suddenly, closing her book with a decisive motion. Ron didn't look up from the board. You're sitting 5 feet from the fire. I know, Hermione said, frowning thoughtfully. But the room should be warmer than this. She stood, took out her wand, and murmured a warming charm. A brief wave of warmth spread outward, but it thinned quickly, dissolving in the air as if the room refused to hold it. Hermione's eyes narrowed. That should have been stronger. The storm's interfering, Ron said, still focused on the chessboard. Magic gets weird in extreme weather. Dad told me once that during a hurricane, their office spells went completely haywire. The castle's compensating, Hermione said, turning toward the stone wall. She stepped closer, and pressed her palm against it. "Feel this." Harry and Ron exchanged the universal look of friends who knew an explanation was coming, but they stood and joined her. The stone beneath Harry's hand was warm. Not just room temperature, warm in a way that felt alive, as if there were a steady current moving through it. "The heating charms are built into the foundation," Hermione said, her voice brightening. "Rowena Ravenclaw's work mostly, though all 4 founders contributed. The castle generates warmth in cold weather, not just spells cast in the air. Something deeper. The stones remember heat. The magic recycles what's been stored here for centuries. Fires, footsteps, human presence, everything." Ron stared at the wall with new appreciation.
So the castle's basically a giant hot water bottle?
Hermione sighed. "That is a terrible analogy, but yes, the concept is similar." They returned to their chairs. Now that Hermione had pointed it out, Harry noticed it everywhere. The room wasn't perfectly warm, not the way it might be in summer, but it held a steady comfort that shouldn't have been possible in a medieval stone tower during a blizzard. It felt like being wrapped in something protective. Ron moved again and announced cheerfully, "Check." Harry studied the board and sighed. His king had nowhere safe to go. "You could at least let me win occasionally," Harry said. "Where would be the learning in that?" Ron asked, entirely too pleased with himself. The portrait hole opened once more. This time, 3 house elves appeared, moving with quiet efficiency. They carried trays laden with steaming mugs and small plates of biscuits. The lead elf, elderly with enormous ears, bowed slightly. "Dobby is saying, young masters and miss, we'll be wanting hot chocolate," he squeaked. "With the storm, warm drinks is needed." Harry's face softened immediately. "Dobby." Dobby's eyes shone. "Harry Potter, sir." "We were just fine," Hermione began automatically. "But yes," Ron added, reaching toward the tray without shame. The elves distributed the drinks among the remaining students. Harry accepted his mug with both hands. The hot chocolate was rich and sweet, with a hint of cinnamon, and real marshmallows floating on top. "This is brilliant," Harry said quietly. "Thank you." Dobby's ears flushed a proud pink. "Dobby is happy to help. Dobby is checking on all common rooms, making sure fires is good and students is warm. This is being a very big storm." Dobby glanced toward the fireplace, which had burned down slightly. With a snap of his fingers, the flames rose higher, perfectly balanced again. "There," Dobby said, satisfied. "You should get somewhere warm yourself," Harry said. "Oh, Dobby is not minding the cold," Dobby replied, but he looked pleased at the concern. "House elves is being very hardy. Dobby will check back later. The storm is being a long one." The elves vanished as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind the scent of chocolate and the comfort of a renewed fire. Harry took a slow sip and felt tension. He hadn't realized he was carrying ease out of his shoulders. Ron dunked a biscuit into his mug and said with full sincerity, "Best job in the world." "They're unpaid laborers," Hermione said, but her tone was weary rather than sharp. They had argued about house elves before, and they would again, but tonight felt too gentle for a fight. "And Dobby seems happy here," Hermione added, conceding the point. "He is happy," Harry said, "and he's got choices now. That matters." Hermione nodded, satisfied. That's the important part. Across the room, the 6th years finished their game and headed upstairs, calling good nights. The common room felt larger with fewer people in it. The portraits settled into softer evening routines, some dozing in their frames, others murmuring to neighbors, occasionally stepping into adjacent paintings for quiet conversation. A witch in medieval robes paused in her journey across the wall to watch their chessboard. "That red-haired boy has quite the strategic mind," she said, studying Ron. Wasted on chess. He should be planning military campaigns. Ron didn't even look up. "I'll keep that in mind if we're ever invaded." Hermione's smile widened despite herself. Ron's next move came with a confident finality. Checkmate. Harry's king toppled over dramatically, and the Black Queen tutted as if she'd known it would happen from the beginning. "I told you," Ron said, pleased. "Hopeless. Rematch," Ron added immediately, hope returning to his voice. "Let me enjoy my hot chocolate first," Harry said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. Outside, the blizzard continued without pause. The white chaos beyond the windows didn't seem to lessen, and the wind pressed against the tower with steady determination. But inside, by the fire, with mugs in their hands and the gentle noise of the common room fading into a calmer hush, the night felt safe. For a long moment, there was nothing Harry needed to do, no mystery tugging at him, no urgent danger demanding a choice. Only warmth, friendship, and the quiet certainty that Hogwarts would hold. With the hot chocolate warming their hands, the common room seemed to settle into an even deeper kind of comfort. Students continued to drift upstairs in small groups, yawning and stretching, gathering books and parchment, as if the storm outside had quietly persuaded everyone to move more slowly. The castle felt closed in around them in the best possible way, like thick walls and old magic had decided the night would be kept safe. Harry watched the room without really thinking about it. Portraits moved from frame to frame, the way people moved between conversations at a party. A few of them had paused their usual routines to watch the weather through painted windows, faces turned toward their own little versions of the storm. Every now and then, a student crossed the room to look out into the real night, then returned to the warmth with a relieved expression. Ron had reset the chess pieces for another game, though he took his time about it, as if he didn't mind stretching the evening longer. The White Queen sat upright, with the air of someone who expected to win simply because she always did. The Black King looked bored before the first move had even been played. Hermione held her mug near her face, letting the warmth rise toward her cheeks. She looked calmer now, the earlier urgency replaced by the quiet satisfaction of being indoors with people she trusted. She still glanced toward the windows from time to time, but there was no tension in her shoulders. "Not tonight." "I don't think I've ever appreciated the common room this much," Ron said, looking around as if seeing it properly for the first time. "Like really appreciated it." Hermione raised an eyebrow. "You appreciate it every time you avoid homework." "That's different," Ron said. "That's survival." Harry smiled, but he understood what Ron meant. There was something about nights like this that made Hogwarts feel less like a school and more like what it truly was. A place that held people. A place that sheltered them without asking for anything in return, except that they live inside it. Ron gestured for Harry to begin. "Go on, then." Harry moved a pawn again, a little more confidently this time. He wasn't going to beat Ron, not realistically, but he could at least stop losing immediately. The pawn stepped forward and looked around, as if wondering why it had been chosen for danger. The White Queen gave a small look of disapproval. "At least he's trying." "Don't encourage him," Ron said, and moved his knight. Hermione's smile widened over the rim of her mug. "I'm not encouraging him. I'm encouraging the concept of effort." The second game went the same way the first had, but slower. Harry managed to defend himself in a way that felt less like panic and more like strategy, and Ron reacted with the pleased air of a person who enjoyed being challenged even if he didn't admit it. The pieces offered commentary as they went, not in loud performance, but in the cutting, opinionated manner of people who believed they knew better than everyone else. At some point, Harry realized that the storm no longer felt like the main event. It was still there, still pressing against the world outside, but it had become background. The common room, the fire, the chairs, the small familiar things, they were what mattered. A pale flake drifted down near the window and melted before it reached the floor. Crookshanks noticed immediately. He rose from his spot near the hearth, like a guard who had been waiting for movement. He followed the flake's fall with intense focus, then sat again, clearly deciding it wasn't worth the effort. "There are still some getting in," Ron said, nodding toward the window. Hermione leaned slightly, studying the glass and the edges of the frame. "The castle's sealed, but it isn't airtight. It can't be. If it's sealed completely, the air would go stale. There has to be circulation." "So Hogwarts is letting in snowflakes on purpose," Ron said, as if testing the idea. "Not on purpose," Hermione corrected. "Not deliberately. Just as a side effect of keeping everything balanced." Harry watched another flake drift down, soft and slow, and for a moment it felt strangely gentle, like the storm outside had reached a single careful finger into the warm room, and then thought better of it. Across the common room, Percy finally put down his parchment and stood, looking around with the weary satisfaction of someone who had finished a task that no one else appreciated. He scanned the room, counting students the way he always did when he thought he might need to report something later. "You three still here?" Percy asked, as if the idea was mildly suspicious. "We're not tired," Ron said quickly. Percy's eyes narrowed in a way that suggested he didn't believe that for a second. "You will be. And when you are, you'll regret it." Hermione's tone was innocent. "We're just having hot chocolate." Percy looked like he wanted to argue, then decided that arguing with Hermione was never worth the effort unless he had official backing. "Fine," he said, "but when you do go up, make sure the fire is properly managed, and don't leave food lying around." Ron gave him a salute that was just barely respectful enough to pass as sincere. Percy shook his head and returned to the staircase. After Percy disappeared, Hermione tilted her head slightly. "He's worrying more lately." "He's always worrying," Ron said. "It's his natural state." "Even more than usual," Hermione said. "He's been reading notices and checking lists, and making sure everyone's where they're supposed to be." "He thinks if he does everything perfectly, nothing bad will happen," Harry said before he could stop himself. Ron looked at him for a moment, then shrugged. But his expression softened. "Yeah," he admitted. "That sounds about right." The words hung in the air for a few seconds. Not heavy exactly, but real. Hogwarts could be warm and safe, but it didn't erase what existed beyond its walls. Harry knew that better than most. Hermione set her mug down carefully as if making a decision. "Let's not talk about that tonight," she said quietly but firmly. Ron nodded immediately. Agreed. Harry didn't argue. He didn't want to talk about it either. Tonight felt like something they were allowed to have, and he didn't want to stain it with fear. He moved another piece, and the game continued. Time passed in that soft, unhurried way again. The number of students in the common room shrank until it felt like the room belonged only to them and the portraits. The painted people seemed quieter now too, as if they had their own version of late-night calm. One old wizard had fallen asleep in his chair, mouth slightly open, a book balanced on his lap. A witch in a neighboring frame arranged flowers in a vase over and over, changing the colors each time as if she couldn't decide what looked right. Hermione's blanket slipped from her shoulder, and she pulled it back up. It's colder than it should be, she said. Not complaining, just observing. Ron tilted his head. You already tested the warming charm. I know, Hermione said. It's not that the fire isn't doing its job. It's that the space is larger. Like the storm is making the room feel bigger. Harry knew what she meant. The edges of the common room felt farther away, not physically, but in the way the air behaved. The warmth stayed near the hearth and the chairs, while the far corners seemed to hold on to winter. Hermione stood again and walked to the wall, placing her palm on the stone. Still warm, she murmured, more to herself than to them. So the foundation charms are steady. Ron leaned back. So we're fine. We are fine, Hermione agreed. I just like understanding why. Harry looked down at the chessboard, then up at his friends. This was one of the things he loved about Hermione, even if he didn't always say it. Her need to understand wasn't just about being right. It was about making the world feel less unpredictable. Ron moved his rook, and Harry adjusted his defense. It wasn't good defense, but it was better than before, and Hermione gave him an approving look that made him feel strangely proud. You're improving, she said. Ron snorted. That's a dangerous thing to tell him. It's true, Hermione replied. And even if it wasn't, it's kind. Harry felt his face warm, and he pretended to focus intensely on the board. I'm only improving because Ron is terrifying. Correct, Ron said, pleased. Fear is an excellent teacher. The portraits behind them shifted. One of them, a stern-looking witch with her hair pulled into a severe knot, had been watching their game with the expression of someone judging a performance. Now she spoke, voice crisp. The red-haired one has discipline, she said. The dark-haired one has instinct. The girl has sense. Together you would survive most things. Ron turned slightly, startled. Thanks. The witch inclined her head as if she had offered a perfectly normal observation and didn't require gratitude. Then she returned to her painting's background, where a candlelit corridor stretched away into quiet. Hermione watched her go. Some of them are more awake during storms, she said. Nick said portraits get chatty, Ron reminded her. Hermione nodded. Yes, but it's more than that. It's like the castle's mood changes, and it changes them too. Harry wanted to ask what Hogwarts' mood was right now, but he wasn't sure he had the words. If the castle could be described as a person, it didn't feel afraid. It felt busy, alert, protective, like something ancient had noticed the weather and decided it would not be moved. Harry made another move. Ron responded. The game narrowed toward an ending, the pieces closing in. Harry managed to capture one of Ron's knights, and the knight protested dramatically about unfair treatment and poor leadership as it was removed from the board. Ron looked impressed, despite himself. All right, that was actually decent. Hermione's eyes gleamed. See? Improvement. Don't start, Ron warned her, but he was smiling. Another pale flake drifted down near the ceiling. Crookshanks looked up, followed it with his eyes, and then lay his head back down, as if deciding he had done enough protecting for one night. Harry watched the flake melt in the warm air, and felt an unexpected affection for the small, stubborn signs of winter. The storm outside was harsh and relentless, but in here, even the snow seemed gentler. Ron shifted his queen, and Harry realized with a small wave of resignation that he was close to losing again. Before you destroy me, Harry said, can we talk about something else? Ron paused mid-move. Like what? Harry glanced towards the window, then back at them. I don't know. Something normal. Hermione sat back in her chair, hugging the blanket around herself. Normal is fine. Ron moved his queen anyway. Normal is also me winning. Harry sighed. You're unbearable. True, Ron said. Hermione's expression softened. Tell us something you're thinking about, Harry. Harry hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't have thoughts. He had too many, most of the time. But tonight felt fragile, in a way that made honesty seem both easier and harder. He stared at the chessboard for a moment as if it might offer him an answer. Then he said quietly, Sometimes I forget what this is like. Ron's grin faded into something more attentive. What's like? This? Harry said, gesturing vaguely at the room. Just sitting, being warm, not having to plan for something. You don't have to plan tonight. I know, Harry said. That's the point. Ron leaned back, thinking. Mum always says storms make people remember what matters, he said, as if repeating something he'd heard 1,000 times. Like, when it's miserable outside, you notice the inside more. Hermione nodded slowly. That's actually quite wise. Ron blinked. Don't tell her I said that. Harry smiled, and the tightness in his chest eased again. I won't. The game continued, but it mattered less now. Harry moved his king away from danger. Ron responded. Hermione watched them with the calm patience of someone who enjoyed the small rituals of friendship as much as the big moments. At some point, Harry realized that he didn't feel the need to look out the window anymore. He knew the storm was there. He knew it would continue. But he also knew Hogwarts would hold. He knew the common room would stay warm enough. He knew the night would pass. And he knew, with an unfamiliar steadiness, that he was not alone. Ron leaned forward, studying the board with exaggerated seriousness. All right, he said. I'll give you one chance to save yourself. Harry narrowed his eyes. You're lying. Ron's mouth twitched. Maybe. Hermione's voice was gentle. Take the chance, anyway. Harry looked at the pieces, thought for longer than usual, and made his move. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't hopeless either. Ron's eyebrows rose in reluctant approval. Well then, Ron said, we look at you. Harry felt a small warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. I'm learning, he said. That's what I was afraid of, Ron replied. Hermione laughed quietly, and for a moment the common room felt like it had always been meant to feel. Not just a room in a tower, not just a place to sleep and study, but a space that held friendship in its center like a steady, living thing. Ron's offer of one chance turned out to be exactly what Harry had expected, a trap dressed up as kindness. Harry lasted longer this time, though, and that alone felt like a victory. He managed to steer the board into a position where Ron had to pause and actually consider the next move, instead of simply choosing whichever path led to the quickest defeat. Hermione noticed immediately. She always noticed. She leaned forward slightly, blanket gathered at her shoulders, eyes moving between the pieces with the careful focus she brought to everything. You've made him think, she said. Ron looked mildly offended. I always think. No, Hermione replied. You usually just dominate. Ron's expression shifted into something pleased. That's true. Harry tried not to smile too widely, because that only encouraged Ron. He moved his bishop with more confidence, and the bishop, still dramatic, reacted as if it had been asked to march into a storm. "This is a terrible idea," it complained. "I hope you know that. You're not the one getting blamed when it goes wrong," Harry muttered. "Excuse you," the bishop said, outraged. "We all get blamed. We are the ones who get sacrificed." Hermione's eyes brightened with amusement. "It's not wrong." Ron moved his knight with deliberate slowness, as if he were putting on a performance for the room. The knight, enthusiastic by nature, acted pleased to be chosen, even if it didn't fully understand what it was being sent to do. Harry watched the pieces for a moment and thought, not for the first time, that wizard chess was the perfect reflection of Ron's personality. Loud in its opinions, dramatic in its victories, convinced the world would be more efficient if everyone simply accepted Ron's plans. Around them, the common room continued to thin. Students who remained were mostly older, lingering because they could, or because they were reluctant to trade warmth for staircases and cold sheets. A few sat with books open but eyes unfocused, reading the same line again and again. Others stayed in clusters, murmuring quietly, enjoying the sense that the night belonged to them. The storm outside had become something you could feel more than you could see. The windows were almost entirely frosted now. The glass transformed into pale patterns that turned the world beyond into a blurred wash of white and grey. Harry could still tell when the wind strengthened, not because of any sound, but because the curtains shifted, as though the air itself had changed its mind. Hermione kept one hand around her mug, though she'd finished the drink long ago. She was using it like an anchor, something warm to hold, while the world outside did whatever it pleased. Ron's move placed Harry in danger again. Harry stared at the board, trying to think the way Hermione would, trying to anticipate, trying to see not just what was happening now, but what would happen after. "Take your time," Hermione said softly, surprising him. Ron gave her a look. "Don't encourage him." "I'm not," Hermione said. "I'm reminding him he's allowed to think." Harry exhaled and forced himself not to rush. He moved his king to a safer square. The king, proud and stubborn, looked relieved and indignant at the same time. "Finally," it said. "Some sense." Ron's queen sniffed. "It won't matter." Harry ignored it and sat back. He could feel the chair's worn comfort, the kind that came from years of people settling into it. The armchairs in this corner of the common room had held generations of Gryffindors, through late-night talks and winter evenings and exams and heartbreaks and celebrations. Harry liked to imagine that some of that comfort lingered, soaked into the fabric, like warmth. Across the room, Percy reappeared briefly at the top of the staircase and looked down into the common room like a lighthouse keeper checking for stray ships. His gaze swept the space, counted heads, noted who remained. He didn't come over this time. He simply nodded, as if satisfied that no one was actively setting anything on fire, and disappeared again. Ron watched him go, with a mix of fondness and irritation. "He's going to write a report about the storm." Hermione tilted her head. "He might. He likes records." "He likes being able to say he knew what to do," Ron corrected. "He's probably already made a list of sensible actions taken by Percy Weasley." Harry chuckled, then felt the laugh soften into something quieter. Percy's fussing was easy to mock, but Harry understood it more than he wanted to admit. There was something comforting about lists and rules when the world could change overnight. Hermione shifted in her chair and glanced toward the window again. "It's getting later." Ron moved another piece. "It's getting better." "Better?" Hermione echoed. Ron nodded toward the frosted glass. "You can tell it's serious now. Proper winter. None of that polite, drifting snow. Hermione opened her mouth to correct him, then decided it wasn't worth the effort. Instead, she said, "The castle's holding it back." Harry looked at her. "Holding it back?" "In a sense," Hermione said carefully. "Not stopping the storm, obviously, but balancing what gets through. The wards, the foundation charms, the heating conduits. Hogwarts doesn't just endure weather. It adjusts to it." Ron leaned back, folding his arms. "So if the storm is worse, the castle works harder." Hermione nodded. "Yes." Harry sat with that for a moment. Hogwarts working harder. Hogwarts responding. Hogwarts adjusting itself for the people inside. It was a strange thought. Harry had always known Hogwarts was extraordinary, but in the day-to-day rush of classes and homework and Quidditch and everything else, it was easy to treat the castle as scenery. A place. A backdrop. Tonight made it feel like something else entirely. The room continued to empty until, at some point, Harry realized there were only a handful of students left besides them. The far corners of the common room felt more distant now, shadows deepening in places where firelight didn't reach. The portraits had grown quieter too, the more active ones settling into their frames, as if they had decided the night had reached the part where everyone should rest. Hermione checked the time with a glance toward the common room clock. An ornate brass piece on the wall that always looked slightly proud of itself. "It's close to midnight," she said. Ron's eyes widened a fraction. "Already?" Harry felt the same mild disbelief. Time moved differently in warmth. Hermione's gaze returned to the window. "The frost patterns have changed." Harry followed her line of sight. He hadn't noticed at first, because the windows were mostly pale and clouded, but she was right. The patterns of ice on the glass weren't random. They were shifting, rearranging themselves into spirals and angles that looked almost intentional, as if the frost were drawing and redrawing the same idea. Ron stood, curiosity overcoming comfort. "All right, that's odd." Harry joined them, stepping closer. The glass was cold even through the heavy curtain, but the air around it held a faint warmth, like the castle was refusing to let the cold fully claim the room. Hermione lifted her hand, not touching the frost, only hovering close. "That isn't normal freezing. It's magic interacting with temperature. The wards are active enough that you can see them." "It looks like writing," Ron said. "It's not," Hermione replied, though her voice carried wonder. "It's more like expression, a castle expressing itself," Ron said, skeptical but not mocking. Hermione nodded. "In really extreme weather, the protective enchantments work harder. When magic works harder, it becomes more visible. Most of the time it's subtle and buried. Tonight, it's closer to the surface." A portrait nearby cleared his throat. A stern wizard with a pointed beard leaned forward, watching the window with the air of someone who had been waiting for someone else to notice. "She is correct," the wizard said. "I remember a winter when the great hall ceiling froze solid. Actual ice. It took days to restore it." Ron looked half impressed and half alarmed. "The great hall froze?" The portrait nodded. "The castle was younger then, less settled, less prepared. Even so, it endured. Hogwarts always endures." Hermione's eyes moved quickly, as if storing every word. "When was that?" The portrait looked pleased to be asked. "The winter of 1709. Coldest on record in those days." The headmaster recruited every student who could produce a reliable flame charm. It became a school-wide effort. Harry imagined it. The whole castle working together. Students and professors and magic, all aimed at one purpose. The thought felt strangely reassuring. The portrait leaned back in his frame, satisfied, and returned to his own quiet world. Hermione lowered her hand and drew a slow breath. "The castle is fine," she said, as if reassuring herself as much as them. "It's just showing more of itself than usual." Ron returned to his chair reluctantly, but his eyes still flicked toward the windows. "All right. Fine. We can be impressed. But I'm still going to win." Harry sat again, and the chess game continued. But it had changed. Harry was still losing, but he didn't mind. There was something else happening in the room that felt more important than victory. Hermione, after a moment's hesitation, closed her book and placed it carefully on the table. That alone was notable. Hermione did not abandon reading lightly. "I want to just sit," she said, as if admitting something. Ron looked at her with exaggerated seriousness. "Are you all right?" Hermione rolled her eyes, but her expression softened. "Yes. I'm just tired, and it's peaceful." End of poem, chapter 3. Harry nodded. Peaceful was the word. They played another few moves, slower now, with long pauses between. The pieces complained less, as if even they were settling. Ron's advantage remained obvious, but he stopped rushing to end it. He started making moves that were clever rather than brutal, as if he'd decided the evening was worth stretching. Harry appreciated it more than he wanted to admit. At some point, Hermione spoke again, voice quiet and thoughtful. "Do you ever think Hogwarts feels different in winter?" Ron shrugged. "It feels colder." Hermione gave him a look. "I mean," Ron corrected himself, "it feels like more Hogwarts. Like the stone and the towers and everything are more present." Hermione's expression brightened. "Yes, exactly." Harry listened. He understood it too, though he hadn't had the words. In winter, the castle felt less like a school and more like a fortress. Not in a prison way, but in a protective way. Thick walls, warm inside. The world outside reduced to white and distance. Hermione folded her blanket tighter and said, "It's like the castle remembers every winter it's ever lived through." Ron made a face. "That's a bit dramatic." Hermione didn't argue. "Maybe. But the magic in the stones is old. It's layered. It's been soaked into this place for centuries. That doesn't just disappear." Harry stared into the firelight for a moment, thinking about layers, about the idea of Hogwarts holding memory the way people did. He'd barely had time to form the thought before Ron delivered another check that forced him to react. Harry moved his king, and the king huffed. "This is undignified." Ron grinned. "It is." Bah. Hermione's attention drifted again, not to her book, but to the room itself. Her gaze moved over the tapestries, the portraits, the shadows in the corners, the way the light rested on the scarlet hanging. It was the look of someone observing a living system. "I read something," Hermione said suddenly, and Ron groaned instinctively. Hermione ignored him. "Not for homework. Just because I was curious." Ron sank deeper into his chair. "Here we go." Harry smiled faintly. "What did you read?" Hermione looked pleased at being asked properly about the castle's internal systems. the way it functions. Ron blinked. It's a castle. It functions by being a castle. Hermione's eyes sharpened. It functions by being a magical ecosystem. Harry leaned forward, interested despite himself. Hermione, when she spoke like this, wasn't just reciting facts. She was trying to explain something that genuinely amazed her. The heating charms, she said, aren't just warming spells placed in rooms. They're part of a network, a conduit system. Think of it like pathways in the stone that carry magical energy. Ron's expression twisted. That sounds unpleasant. It's brilliant, Hermione corrected. The founders needed Hogwarts to do more than hold people. They needed it to adapt, to protect, to support thousands of students over centuries. So they built magic into the structure itself. Harry thought of the warm stone under his palm earlier. He could almost imagine something moving beneath the surface, not physically, but like a current. Hermione continued, voice steady. The conduits draw ambient magic from the inhabitants. Students, professors, even ghosts contribute tiny amounts simply by existing here. The castle channels that energy into practical systems. Heating, lighting, protective wards, the staircases, the way rooms shift, the way doors respond. Ron stared at her. So, we're powering the castle. In a way, Hermione said. Yes. Harry felt a strange spark of awe. Hogwarts wasn't just a place he lived in. It was a place that lived with them. That's why Hogwarts feels different in summer, Hermione added. When most students are gone, the magic becomes quieter, more dormant. It's waiting. And in conditions like tonight, the castle draws on that stored energy, and the energy of everyone inside, and it does what it was built to do. Ron looked around the common room with new eyes, as if seeing it as something larger than furniture and stone. So right now, it's actively protecting us. Yes, Hermione said. It always is, but tonight the storm demands more. Harry sat back and let the idea settle. There was something comforting about it, and something humbling too. Hogwarts wasn't just a school that tolerated students. It was a structure designed to hold them safely while they grew. The chessboard became secondary again. Harry moved a piece. Ron responded, but the game had lost its urgency. Hermione's voice softened. I find it comforting. Ron glanced at her. The idea of being used as a battery? Hermione gave him a look that would have silenced most people. The idea that Hogwarts wants to keep us safe, she corrected. That it responds, Harry didn't say anything, but he agreed. They sat for a while after that, in a quiet that didn't feel awkward. Hermione rested her head back against the chair, eyes half-lidded. Ron's shoulders relaxed. Harry felt the weight in his chest ease, as if the castle itself were making space for him. Then Ron spoke again, and his voice changed the shape of the quiet. This reminds me of winter at the Burrow. Hermione opened her eyes fully. How? Ron stared into the fire, expression thoughtful. Not the fancy bits. Not Christmas. Just the boring winter nights. When it's too cold to go outside and too early to sleep, Mum would make hot chocolate, and we'd all pile into the living room. Dad would be in his chair, reading something ridiculous. Percy would pretend he wasn't listening to us. Fred and George would be planning some disaster. Ginny would demand stories. What kind of stories? Hermione asked, clearly interested. Ron's ears turned slightly pink, as if he was surprised by his own softness. Ghost stories mostly. Mum's good at them. Dad tries to make them educational. He always ends up explaining some detail about spirits, and then it stops being scary. Harry felt something twist in him. Not painful, exactly, but tender. He had been to the Burrow. He had sat at that table, felt that warmth. It had felt like stepping into a life he hadn't known he was allowed to want. Hermione said quietly, "That sounds lovely." "It is," Ron admitted. Then he looked at Harry, and his expression shifted, cautious, as if he didn't want to be cruel by accident. "What about you?" Harry's first instinct was to shrug it off, to make a joke, to avoid, but the common room was quiet, and the night was gentle, and Hermione's gaze was steady, and Ron's question wasn't nosy. It was simply human. "The Dursleys didn't do that," Harry said. Ron's expression tightened in sympathy, but he didn't interrupt. Harry stared at the chessboard, not really seeing it. Dudley would be in front of the television. Vernon would read the paper and complain. Petunia would fuss in the kitchen. And I would stay out of the way. Hermione's face softened into something close to sadness. Harry didn't like that look, but he let it sit there for once. He didn't fight it. Then he added quickly, because he didn't want pity to take root, "But this is better." Ron blinked. "This?" Harry gestured vaguely around them. "This, sitting here, being warm. No one trying to make me feel like I'm a problem. No one expecting me to pretend. Just comfortable." Hermione's voice was quiet. "We are your family." Ron nodded. "Yeah, we are." Harry felt something in his throat tighten. He swallowed and stared at the fire again, letting their words settle like a blanket. Ron shifted awkwardly, clearly moved but refusing to become too emotional about it. "You and Hermione. You're the siblings I never asked for." Hermione's eyes glinted with amusement. "That's not how siblings work." "It is if you're the Weasleys," Ron muttered. Harry's smile returned, small but real. The common room clock marked midnight, and the hour felt significant in the way certain moments did at Hogwarts. Not because anything dramatic happened immediately, but because the night seemed to deepen. The firelight looked softer. The shadows stretched slightly longer. The air felt changed, like the castle had drawn a slow breath. Harry found himself standing without deciding to. He moved towards the window again, drawn by instinct. Ron and Hermione followed. Beyond the frosted glass, the storm had shifted. The clouds had broken in places, and through those gaps, stars shone with unnatural clarity. The snow still fell, but it looked different now. Not calmer exactly, but arranged. The patterns were larger, the movement more deliberate. Hermione pressed close to the glass, breath faintly clouding it. "Can you feel it?" Harry could. The air held a charge, not frightening, but alive. His skin prickled slightly, like the castle's magic was nearer to the surface. His fingertips tingled. It was as if Hogwarts had stepped closer to them. Ron stared out, wide-eyed. "That's not normal." "It's old magic," Hermione whispered. "The storm is stirring it up." "Hogwarts is responding." Harry's gaze slid toward the forbidden forest in the distance. He could barely see it through the falling snow, but something about it looked wrong in a way that felt right. The trees seemed to carry a faint light, a subtle glow that did not belong to moon or torch. Hermione noticed too. "The trees are ancient," she murmured. "Older than the castle, some of them. They have their own magic." A darker shape moved within the forest's edge. large and silent. Then another. Ron swallowed. Centaurs? Maybe, Hermione said, not taking her eyes from the distance. Or Thestrals. They live there. This is their home. Harry watched the shadow move closer to the edge, and for a moment he felt, impossibly, as if something out there was looking back. Not threatening, not hostile. Simply aware. The moment passed, and the shape withdrew into the trees. Ron shifted, pulling his blanket tighter. So the forest is watching the storm, too. Harry nodded. Even they think it matters. They stood like that, pressed together in the cold edge of the window, watching the world outside behave like a living spell. Then Harry noticed something he hadn't seen earlier. A smaller window set into the wall beside the main one was slightly open, barely a crack. Snowflakes drifted through, carried by a subtle current, and then melted in the warm air. That explains Crookshanks, Ron said. Hermione frowned slightly. It's odd the castle would allow that. Should we close it? Ron asked. Hermione hesitated, then shook her head. Leave it. If it's open for a reason. Pressure balance, circulation. The castle knows what it's doing. More flakes drifted in, but these didn't fall randomly. They moved as if guided, spiraling gently, looping in slow patterns like tiny dancers, tracing a rehearsed routine. Ron stared. Is the snow doing that on purpose? Hermione's eyes shone. Magic does this sometimes when there's excess energy. It becomes decorative. Beauty for its own sake. Harry watched the flakes for a long moment. They weren't threatening. They weren't even cold by the time they reached the room. They were simply there, like the storm had offered them a small gift. Crookshanks, who had been dozing near the hearth, lifted his head and watched too. He didn't leap. He didn't hunt. He simply observed, ears twitching slightly, as if even he recognized these weren't intruders. Behind them, a portrait stirred. An old wizard Harry didn't remember seeing awake before, peered out of his frame, eyes watery with age but sharp with awareness. You children see it, the wizard said quietly. The castle's true face. Hermione stepped closer, cautious and respectful. Does this happen often? The wizard shook his head. Rare. Storms like this, old magic rising. Not dangerous, just honest. Hogwarts, showing what it really is beneath lessons and rules. Ancient. Wild. Beautiful. Harry felt his chest tighten with something like reverence. What happens? Ron asked, voice quieter than usual. Nothing dramatic, the wizard said. Bah. No prophecy. No duel. Just a night when the castle lets you see its soul. It makes you understand why the founders chose this place. The magic was already here. They gave it purpose. The wizard's eyelids lowered. Watch while you can. Moments like these don't come often. He settled back into stillness, and the common room felt even quieter for having heard him. Ron looked at Harry and Hermione. We should see it from somewhere else. Hermione's immediate response was practical. It's after midnight. Ron nodded. That's why it's worth it. No one's around, and we might not get another chance. Harry felt the pull, too, an urge that wasn't recklessness so much as curiosity so strong it felt like gravity. The castle was doing something extraordinary. Staying inside felt like looking at a masterpiece through a keyhole. We could just go to another window, Harry said, testing the idea aloud. Not outside, just higher. Hermione hesitated. You could see the battle in her. Rules versus wonder. Ron leaned forward. We could go to the North Tower landing. It has windows on all sides. You can see the lake and the forest. It's not the astronomy tower, so it might not be locked. Hermione exhaled slowly. If we get caught, who's going to catch us? Ron asked. Filch will be somewhere warm. Most professors will be in their rooms. Harry added, we can take the map. Hermione's resistance weakened visibly. The map was the difference between foolish and calculated, and Hermione was always more comfortable when there was a system. Fine, she said at last, but her mouth twitched like she was trying not to smile. We take the map, we take a blanket, and if we see anyone, we turn back immediately. Ron looked triumphant, brilliant. They moved quickly, but quietly. Harry went up to the dormitory and retrieved the Marauder's map from his trunk. Ron grabbed an extra blanket from the common room, and Hermione pocketed the remaining biscuits from the tray, as if preparing for a long expedition rather than a short walk. Crookshanks watched them with sleepy interest, and then returned to the hearth, clearly deciding adventure was for humans. The fat lady's portrait was closed, her painted face turned slightly as if she'd retreated into her own room. Harry eased the portrait open carefully, and the cold in the corridor beyond met them immediately. The difference between common room warmth and stone hallway chill was sharp enough to make Harry pause. Ron wrapped the blanket around his shoulders. That's unpleasant. Hermione pulled her cloak closer. We'll be quick. Harry unfolded the Marauder's map, smoothing it open. He tapped it with his wand, spoke the familiar words, and watched the castle bloom across parchment in careful detail. They leaned in together, heads close, scanning for dots and names. Filch was indeed in his office, motionless for the moment. Mrs. Norris prowled the lower corridors. Most professors were in their quarters. Dumbledore's dart sat in his office, which did not surprise Harry. Dumbledore kept his own hours. Clear, Harry whispered. Ron pointed. North Tower is this way. They moved out into the corridor, steps careful, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. The castle at night always felt different, but tonight it felt especially alive. The air held that same faint charge they'd felt at the window. The stones beneath their feet seemed warmer in places, as if magic ran close to the surface and then dipped away again. They passed suits of armor that stood rigid, but their helmets were angled subtly, as though they were watching. Harry couldn't tell if that was his imagination, but Hermione glanced at them too, eyes narrowed. Portraits in this corridor were more awake than usual. Some stood at the edges of their frames, looking out into the hallway, faces turned toward windows, as if drawn by the storm's strange behavior. A witch in a high-collared gown nodded at them as they passed, expression knowing. Ron muttered, Everyone's acting like they're in on something. Hermione whispered back, Maybe they are. They took a staircase that mercifully stayed where it was meant to. On nights like this, Nick had warned, staircases could become more unpredictable, but this one remained steady, as if the castle had decided these three students were allowed to pass. Harry held the map in front of him whenever the corridor opened up, checking corners before they reached them. It made him feel strangely calm, like they were doing something reasonable rather than wandering after midnight. At last, they reached the broader corridor that led toward the North Tower landing. The windows here were tall, and the view beyond them stole Harry's breath even through frost and snow. From this height, the storm looked like a living thing. Snow moved in vast spirals across rooftops and towers. The castle's upper structures were coated in white, ledges sculpted into smooth shapes by wind. The world beyond, forest and lake and mountains, seemed to glow faintly under scattered starlight. Hermione stopped, eyes wide. It's stronger up here. Ron swallowed, suddenly quieter. Yeah. They continued forward, and then the corridor opened into the circular North Tower landing, a space with windows on all sides. Moonlight poured through breaks in cloud, painting the room in pale silver. The lake lay to the east, frozen and covered in snow, reflecting starlight like a massive quiet mirror. The forest to the north held that faint inner glow, the trees looking like they carried old secrets under heavy branches. To the west, mountains rose like guardians, their peaks lost in drifting cloud. And to the south, beyond the castle grounds, Hogsmeade's lights flickered faintly through the snow, small and distant, like a handful of stars that had fallen to earth. But it was the snow that held Harry's attention most. From here, the patterns were unmistakable. The storm wasn't scattering flakes randomly. It was drawing shapes across the landscape, vast spirals that curved around the grounds, geometric lines that formed and dissolved, flowing designs that looked, for one astonishing moment, like symbols. Hermione stepped closer to the glass, eyes shining. It's creating. Ron pressed his face near the frost without thinking. Is that? Harry saw it too. On the grounds below, faint but clear enough from this height, the outline of a lion emerged in the snow, enormous and proud. Nearby, other shapes formed: an eagle, a badger, a serpent. The four house symbols traced into the landscape as if the castle itself were marking the storm with identity. Hogwarts is celebrating itself, Harry said, voice barely above a whisper. Hermione nodded slowly, overwhelmed. It's showing what it is, what it stands for. Ron stared, expression open, in a way Harry rarely saw. I've lived here my whole life, and I've never seen this. Harry felt something settle into place inside him. Hogwarts wasn't just a school. It wasn't even just a home. It was a living piece of ancient magic, awake and aware in ways that most students never had reason to notice. Hermione lifted one hand, pressing it against the glass gently. We should remember this, she whispered. Every detail. Harry nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. They stood together, blankets wrapped around their shoulders, looking out at the storm's artistry and the castle's response. And Harry felt the connection to Hogwarts deepen into something he couldn't quite name. A sense of belonging that was older than school rules and house points. A sense that he was part of something that had existed for centuries and would continue long after he was gone. After a while, the cold began to seep into their bones, despite the blankets. Ron shifted from foot to foot, trying not to admit he was freezing. Hermione noticed anyway. She always noticed. We should head back soon, she said reluctantly, before we become part of the landscape. Harry glanced down at the map again, checking their route and the dots nearby. Filch had moved, but he was nowhere close. Mrs. Norris remained far below. The corridors between them and Gryffindor Tower looked clear. We're safe, Harry said quietly. Ron took one last long look at the snow-drawn symbols. I'm going to remember this forever. Hermione's voice was soft. Me too. They turned away from the windows at last, reluctant but practical, and began the walk back through the cold corridors, carrying the sight of Hogwarts's secret winter face with them, like something precious and fragile. And as they moved through the castle, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that the night wasn't finished yet, not with the magic still so close to the surface, not with the portraits so awake, not with the storm still drawing. The walk back from the North Tower felt different from the walk there. On the way up, they had moved with the careful focus of students breaking curfew, minds sharp with the fear of being caught. On the way down, The castle itself seemed to lean toward them with a quieter kind of attention, as if it knew they had seen something important and was deciding what to do with that knowledge. The corridors were still cold, but the cold no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like a reminder, a thin, honest edge of winter against their cheeks, proof that the world outside was still locked in snow and wind. Their breath hung faintly in the air. Their steps were soft and deliberate, on stone that had held thousands of footsteps before theirs. Harry kept the Marauder's map open, partly for safety, partly because it made him feel as though the castle was simpler to understand when it was drawn out in ink and labels. Hogwarts could be confusing in daylight, but at night, in the middle of an unusual storm, it seemed to have moods. It shifted in subtle ways. It breathed. Ron walked beside him, blanket draped like a cloak, shoulders hunched against the chill. Hermione stayed close on Harry's other side, her eyes moving constantly. Not from fear exactly, but from awareness. She looked like someone trying to commit every detail to memory. The way the torches burned, the way the air felt, the way the castle seemed to hold itself differently. They passed a row of suits of armor. Earlier they had looked merely decorative, silent as stone. Now, as they approached, Harry noticed that several helmets were angled slightly toward a window, as if listening. Ron slowed, staring. Are they watching? Hermione's voice was very quiet. In weather like this, the magic gets stirred. Things that are usually dormant become more responsive. Harry didn't say what he was thinking, but he felt it. Hogwarts was awake in a way it wasn't most nights. Not alarmed, not dangerous, just present. A few steps later, they passed a portrait of a witch in a pale blue gown. She was standing at the edge of her frame, gaze fixed beyond the corridor, as if she could see through stone walls. As the trio moved past, she turned her head slowly and looked directly at them. Her expression was not surprised. It was not disapproving. It was almost approving in a reserved, dignified way. Beautiful night for it, she said. Ron paused mid-step. For what? But she had already turned away, returning to her painted world, where snow fell outside a window that could never truly open. They continued, and Harry felt a faint shiver that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the unsettling kind of feeling that came when the castle seemed to speak in riddles. Usually, Harry would have taken it as a warning. Tonight, it felt more like an invitation. Hermione glanced at Harry's hands. Check the map again. Harry did. Filch's dot remained far away, moving slowly through a corridor on a lower floor. Mrs. Norris prowled in a different wing. None of the professors seemed to be wandering. The staff quarters were still. Still clear, Harry whispered. Ron exhaled a little. Good. They turned down a corridor that ran behind a tapestry Harry had passed so many times he'd barely noticed it during the day. The tapestry showed Barnabas the Barmy attempting to train trolls for ballet. The trolls looked confused and stubborn. Barnabas looked determined and slightly desperate. Normally it would have made Ron grin. Tonight Ron's attention was on the wall behind it. Hermione slowed, too. She had that look again. The look she got when she sensed the possibility of learning something rare. Barnabas, she said quietly, isn't this the tapestry we heard the portraits mention earlier? Harry's attention sharpened. He hadn't realized how firmly the earlier conversation had lodged itself inside him until Hermione said it aloud. Ron leaned toward the wall, then straightened as if remembering what they were doing. We said we'd go straight back. Hermione didn't argue, but her eyes flicked toward the map again. We can still decide. Just look. Harry hesitated. It wasn't rational. Not entirely. They had already seen more than enough for one night. They had already broken curfew. They had already ventured somewhere they weren't supposed to be. But the castle felt like it was holding its breath. Harry checked the map again, slower this time. The corridor behind Barnabas did not show any dots besides theirs. No Filch, no Mrs. Norris, no Professor out for a midnight walk. Ron's voice dropped to a whisper. So we could. Hermione's mouth tightened. We shouldn't. But she didn't move away. Harry felt the pull again, that same curious gravity that had drawn them to the tower windows. He couldn't explain it properly. It wasn't the usual urge for trouble. It was the feeling of being near something ancient and significant and wanting, desperately to understand it before it vanished. We'll be quick, Harry decided. Ron's face brightened immediately. Then he tried to look serious again. Quick, Hermione exhaled, half resignation and half excitement. Fine, but if the map shows anyone coming, we leave immediately. They slipped behind the tapestry, found the small door, and eased it open. The passage beyond was narrower than the main corridors, and felt older, as if the stone here had been built first and renovated less often. The air was colder too, carrying that same faint, charged feeling that had been strongest near the tower windows. They stepped through and closed the door behind them. The corridor they entered was quiet, lined with portraits in varying states of occupancy. Some frames showed sleeping figures curled in chairs. Some were empty, their subjects wandering elsewhere. A few were not portraits of people at all, but scenes, views of Hogwarts in different centuries, a courtyard under summer sun, a snow-covered bridge from an era when the castle's towers looked slightly different. Their footsteps sounded too loud, so they slowed further, moving like shadows. And then they saw them. 4 frames that Harry could swear had been empty. Every other time he'd passed through this area were occupied now. Not by ordinary witches and wizards, by the founders. Harry recognized them immediately, not because he'd ever seen them like this, but because the castle itself taught you their shapes. Sorting hat, songs, tapestries, statues, portraits, and books. It didn't matter. The moment he saw them, he knew. Godric Gryffindor stood tall, sword at his hip, posture proud and alert. His hair and beard were a deep red gold, and his eyes carried a steady warmth, the kind that made you feel both challenged and protected. Helga Hufflepuff sat in a comfortable chair, a cup in her hands, her face kind but not soft. There was strength in her, the strength of someone who chose to nurture and protect and was never mistaken for weak. Rowena Ravenclaw stood beside a desk covered in books and strange instruments. Her diadem glinted at her brow. Her gaze was sharp and thoughtful, as if she was studying them as much as they were studying her. And Salazar Slytherin leaned against a stone wall within his frame, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He looked like someone who rarely revealed what he thought, even when he was thinking deeply. They were vivid in a way ordinary portraits were not. The colors felt richer. The edges of their forms felt closer to reality. It was as if the storm had pulled them forward through centuries of distance, allowing them to occupy their frames more fully. All 4 were watching the students with clear interest. Ron went very still. Hermione's eyes widened until Harry thought she might stop breathing. Harry felt his heart quicken, not with fear, but with awe so sharp it almost hurt. Well, Gryffindor said at last, his voice resonant with warmth and authority. Students abroad at midnight during a magnificent storm. That shows spirit. Gardens or improper judgment, Slytherin murmured, though there was a trace of amusement in his tone that softened the words. Hufflepuff's gaze moved over them like sunlight. They came to see us, she said gently. curiosity, and respect. Hello, young ones. Don't be frightened. We are only portraits, after all. Echoes. Hermione found her voice, though it sounded slightly unsteady. You're awake. Ravenclaw inclined her head. As awake as we can be. The castle remembers us more clearly when its magic is strong. We exist in these frames always, but usually as faint impressions. Tonight, we are nearer to what we were. Harry swallowed and said what felt truest. We heard you might appear because of the storm. Gryffindor nodded, approving. Storms like this stir old magic. Hogwarts flexes, and when it does, we are drawn close. Ron blurted, "This is mad." Hufflepuff smiled. Perhaps. But not Ron. Hermione's eyes were bright with the need to ask 100 questions at once. She managed to hold herself still only by gripping the edge of her cloak. The snow patterns, she said. The house symbols. Did you create them? The castle did, Hufflepuff corrected gently. We poured ourselves into Hogwarts when we built it. Our values, our magic, our choices. In some ways, the stones remember. Tonight, the castle honors that memory. Ravenclaw's gaze shifted to Hermione with something like recognition. You feel it, don't you? The way magic is not simply cast, but lived in. Hermione nodded, breath catching. Yes. Slytherin's eyes moved to Harry, and the intensity of that look made Harry's spine straighten. It wasn't hostile. It was assessing. Curious. As if Slytherin had seen many students walk these halls, but still found certain ones worth studying. You're wondering why we speak with you, Slytherin said calmly. Why we reveal ourselves. Harry nodded slowly. Because you represent what we hoped for, Ravenclaw said, taking over, her voice measured and thoughtful. When we created the house system, we knew it would create divisions. We accepted that as necessary. Students need identity. They need belonging. But we also hoped that friendships would cross boundaries. That courage, cunning, wisdom, and loyalty might learn from each other. Her gaze moved over them, and for a moment Harry felt as if she was seeing more than the colors of their scarves. Seeing choices, seeing patterns. A Gryffindor, and a Gryffindor, Ravenclaw said, a hint of humor in her voice. And yet I see Ravenclaw's thirst for knowledge in one of you, and Hufflepuff's loyalty binding you together, and a certain resourcefulness in wandering the castle at midnight. Ron opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure whether to be offended or proud. You are more than your house, Ravenclaw continued. And that is exactly as it should be. Harry heard himself speak before he fully decided to. The hat wanted to put me in Slytherin. The words landed in the corridor like a confession. Ron's head snapped toward Harry. Hermione's eyes widened. Slytherin did not look surprised. He did not look pleased or displeased. He simply nodded, as if Harry had confirmed something he already knew. Of course it did, Slytherin said. You have qualities I valued. Ambition, resourcefulness, a willingness to ignore rules when they conflict with what you believe is right. Harry felt something tighten in his chest, instinctive, wary. He had spent years hearing Slytherin spoken about like a warning. Slytherin's voice remained calm. The hat sees what you could become, but you chose Gryffindor. That choice matters more than any tendency. We built that into the castle deliberately. Choice over destiny. Hermione's expression shifted, softening. as if she understood the weight of what those words meant to Harry. Ron, still processing, managed to find his voice. I thought Slytherin House was all about pure blood stuff. Slytherin's mouth tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something like acknowledgement. In life, I had my prejudices and my fears, he said. I believed magic should be protected, preserved. I was wrong about many things. Ron stared, shocked. Slytherin's eyes did not waver. Death provides clarity. This portrait carries my knowledge and my temperament, yes. But centuries of observation educate even painted echoes. My house has produced heroes and villains, as has every house. Blood matters far less than I believed. Gryffindor stepped forward slightly in his frame, expression warm. We portraits learn from what we observe. 1,000 years of students passing through these halls, proving again and again that courage comes in many forms. Hufflepuff's voice was gentle but firm. We made mistakes. We were founders, not prophets. Ravenclaw looked at Hermione again, then at Ron, then at Harry, and yet, she said, Hogwarts endures. It grows. It becomes more than we imagined, because students like you live inside it and make choices we could never predict. Harry felt that tightness in his chest loosen in a way that almost made him dizzy. It wasn't that the past changed, it was that the present offered something else. A permission to be complex. A reminder that being nearly sorted one way did not doom him, that he was not trapped by some predetermined darkness. Hufflepuff set her cup down. We are proud, she said simply, of what Hogwarts has become. Of students who see beyond boundaries and find friendship based on who they are, not where they sit at the table. Ron shifted awkwardly, clearly moved, and then did what Ron always did when emotions rose too close to the surface. He made it practical. So, you're saying we're doing all right? Gryffindor's eyes crinkled with amusement. You are doing more than all right. Hermione's voice trembled with excitement she could barely contain. How is this possible? I mean, the portraits, the magic. Ravenclaw lifted a hand, stopping her gently. There is limited time, she said. The storm's strength is easing. The castle's magic will settle. We will fade back to our usual state. Hermione's face fell. Already, Ravenclaw nodded. Soon. Present, but distant. Aware, but unable to speak as clearly. Slytherin's gaze flicked towards the corridor, as if he could sense the shift too. You have time for a question, he said. One question worth asking. Hermione's hand twitched upward automatically, as if she were in class. She stopped herself and blushed. Ravenclaw's expression softened. Ask it, she said kindly. Make it count. Hermione stared at the founders for a long moment, thinking hard. The usual flood of questions seemed to organize itself into a single thread, a single choice. Then she asked, voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes, what is the most important thing you learned from building Hogwarts? The one lesson you would want students to know. The founders fell silent. For a moment, Harry thought they were communicating without words, some shared understanding passing between them. Then Gryffindor spoke, voice warm and certain. That safety and growth require the same foundation, Gryffindor said. We built these walls thick not to imprison students, but to give them a place secure enough that they could dare to learn, dare to fail, dare to become. Hufflepuff's eyes were kind. Hogwarts is shelter, she said, but it is also challenge. The world beyond will always have storms. What matters is who you become within these walls, and who you choose beside you. Ravenclaw's gaze sharpened, thoughtful. Never become so comfortable that you stop growing, she said. Curiosity is not a luxury. It is survival. Slytherin's voice was quieter than the others, but it carried weight. And remember this, he said. A choice made in fear is still a choice. A choice made in courage is still a choice. Do not let anyone tell you that your nature is fixed. Harry felt those words settle into him, like something placed carefully into his hands. Ron swallowed. Thanks, he said, awkward but sincere, for building it, for all of it. Harry nodded, finding his voice. For giving us a home. Slytherin's mouth curved faintly. You give it life, he said. We laid stones and cast spells. You and thousands like you made it matter. Ravenclaw's eyes moved to the side of her frame, where a window was visible behind her. The light outside it had shifted. The storm's intensity was changing. Even in the corridor, Harry could feel the charged quality in the air beginning to soften. It is time, Ravenclaw said gently. The portraits were changing too. The vividness that had made them feel almost real began to fade, not disappearing, but retreating. Their colors dulled slightly. The edges of their forms became more like paint than flesh. Gryffindor's voice remained steady. Return to your house, he said. Sleep well, young lions. You have witnessed something special. Hermione's voice was urgent, fearful of losing even a second. Will you remember this tomorrow, when everything is normal again? Will you remember talking to us? Ravenclaw nodded. We will remember, she said, though we will be distant again. But the memory remains. Harry whispered, and we will too. Even Slytherin looked warm then. His expression transformed into something unexpectedly gentle. Good, he said. And then the moment slipped away. The founders did not vanish completely, but their presence withdrew until they looked like ordinary portraits again. Beautiful, ancient paintings of long-dead witches and wizards, still and silent. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stood in the corridor, breath visible, hearts pounding, the air suddenly feeling emptier. Ron spoke first, in a whisper that sounded like he was afraid to break whatever fragile thread remained. Did that really just happen? Hermione's voice was firm, fierce with certainty. Yes. Yes, it did. Harry nodded. He could still feel it in his bones, the way the magic had been near, the way the founders' voices had sounded, like history leaning close. Hermione turned sharply to Harry's map. Check. Now. Harry looked down. Filchester was moving. Not close yet, but closer than before. Mrs. Norris was still lower, but Filch's path angled in a direction that could bring him toward them if they waited. Ron didn't need to be told twice. We should go. Hermione's mouth tightened. Walk, don't run. Ron gave her a look. You're impossible. And you, Hermione replied, are obvious. They moved quickly but controlled, slipping back through the corridor behind Barnabas's tapestry, closing the door softly and returning to the main corridor as if they belonged there. The castle on their way back felt calmer, as if the peak of whatever had been happening had passed. Portraits still watched from frames, but fewer spoke. The suits of armor stood still again, helmets no longer angled. They reached the fat lady's portrait without incident. She opened with a grumble about cold drafts and students wandering at ridiculous hours, but she let them in. The common room welcomed them with warmth. The fire was lower now, but still steady. Crookshanks lay exactly where they had left him, stretched on the hearthrug, as if the idea of leaving had never crossed his mind. Harry sank into his chair, exhaustion catching up to him all at once. Ron dropped into his own chair with a long, relieved exhale. Hermione stood for a moment, as if she couldn't quite believe the room was ordinary again, then sat slowly, clutching the edge of her blanket. That was, Ron said finally, the most insane thing that has ever happened. Hermione looked at him with disbelief. We have fought a troll. Ron blinked. Fine. The second most insane thing. Harry let out a quiet laugh, and the sound felt good. Hermione's expression shifted into something practical. We can never tell anyone. Ron nodded immediately. They'd never believe us. Harry stared into the firelight. I don't need anyone else to believe it, he said. We know it happened. That's enough. Hermione's voice softened. I'm going to remember every word. Ron rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking his age. I'm going to remember how cold that corridor was. Harry smiled, the kind of smile that came from something deep settling into place. The castle's magic had retreated, the storm had eased, and the extraordinary had begun to fold itself back into ordinary life. But Harry could still feel the night's warmth under his ribs, not just from fire and blankets, from belonging, from being seen, from knowing, with a clarity he hadn't expected, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. After they returned to the common room, something in the air shifted from excitement to quiet reverence. The room hadn't changed. Scarlet hangings, worn chairs, the hearth with its steady glow, the familiar portraits half asleep in their frames. But it felt as if the night itself had softened, as if Hogwarts had finished its most dramatic display and was now content to let its students simply exist inside it. Harry sat very still for a while, hands resting on the arms of his chair, staring into the fire without really seeing it. His mind was full in a way that didn't lend itself to immediate conversation. He kept replaying small details: the vividness of Gryffindor's eyes, the calm certainty in Ravenclaw's voice, the unexpected warmth that had altered Slytherin's severe expression. He remembered Hufflepuff's gentle strength. He remembered the way the portraits had spoken about choice, about becoming, about friendship outlasting stone. Beside him, Ron fidgeted, as if his body couldn't decide whether to collapse or continue moving. He stretched his shoulders, adjusted the blanket, rubbed his hands together, then finally gave up and leaned back in his chair with the defeated posture of someone accepting that he was exhausted. Hermione didn't reach for her book. That alone was remarkable. Instead, she sat with her blanket gathered around her, staring down at her own hands as if she were trying to hold on to the memory through sheer force of will. Her expression was focused, slightly distant, like someone silently reciting something important so it wouldn't slip away. Ron spoke first, because Ron always spoke first when silence grew too deep. So, he said quietly, we basically just had a conversation with the founders. Hermione's head lifted. Yes. Ron blinked as if expecting someone to tell him it was a joke. That's not normal. Hermione's mouth twitched. No. Harry exhaled slowly. It feels like a dream. Hermione's gaze snapped to him, fierce and certain. It wasn't a dream. Harry nodded. I know. It just feels like one. Ron stared into the fire. What if it only happens once in 1,000 years? Hermione shook her head. Nick said he's only seen them conscious a few times. The portraits, they're there, but not like that. That was rare. Ron's face tightened with an emotion he didn't fully know what to do with. Then we were lucky. Hermione's voice softened. Not just lucky. We were there. We looked. Most people don't look. Harry thought of the North Tower windows, the snow drawn into symbols, the forest glowing faintly. He thought of the corridor behind Barnabas, the way the air had felt charged, as if magic itself had stepped closer. Hermione was right. Most people would have gone to bed, missed it, woken the next day to snow, and assumed it had simply been weather. Ron shifted again, restless. We can't tell anyone. Hermione nodded immediately. Ron hesitated, then said, Not even, Hermione confirmed, as if she already knew who he meant. Not even the people we trust. It isn't about trust. It's about keeping it intact. Harry understood. Some things were so special that speaking them aloud to the wrong person could make them feel smaller. Not because they weren't real, but because other people would want proof, explanations, arguments. They would drag the moment into daylight and pick it apart until it felt ordinary. Harry didn't want that. He wanted to keep it like it was, theirs. Ron let out a long breath and tried, clearly, to drag the mood back towards something safer. All right, he said, clapping his hands once. We've done something impossible. We've broken curfew. We've survived. Now we can be sensible and go to bed. Hermione stared at him. Sensible. Ron lifted his hands. Relatively sensible. Harry glanced toward the staircase and felt how heavy his limbs were. He was tired in a way that went beyond sleep. It was the kind of tiredness that came after a long stretch of emotion, after carrying ore too big for your body to hold comfortably. Hermione's shoulders slumped a little. We should. But none of them moved. The chairs held them. The fire held them. The common room itself seemed to invite them to stay, as if Hogwarts didn't want the night to end too abruptly. The storm outside had eased in intensity, but winter still clung to the windows. Snow still drifted, though it no longer pressed with the same relentless force. The wind had changed, turning into a steady, patient presence. Harry stared at the fire and realized he didn't want to climb into his bed yet. The idea of leaving this space felt wrong, like stepping out of a sanctuary. I don't feel like going upstairs, he admitted. Ron glanced at him, then at Hermione. Me neither. Hermione looked as if she were about to argue, then she didn't. All right, she said quietly. We can stay a bit longer. Ron's shoulders relaxed, as if permission had been granted for the thing he wanted but wouldn't have asked for directly. They sat in a comfortable silence. The portraits around the room had mostly settled. A few remained awake. But even they had softened into quieter routines. A wizard polishing a goblet in his frame. A witch adjusting her shawl and settling into a chair. A pair of old friends in neighboring portraits, murmuring to each other in a way that felt like the painted version of whispering. Crookshanks lay stretched on the rug by the hearth, tail flicking once in mild contentment, then stillness. Hermione shifted her blanket higher and finally spoke again, voice thoughtful. I keep thinking about what Gryffindor said, about safety and growth needing the same foundation. Ron nodded slowly. Yeah. Harry swallowed. And Slytherin. About choice. Hermione's eyes lifted to Harry with quiet understanding. That was important. Harry stared into the fire. I didn't realize how important until he said it. Ron's brow furrowed. It's always mattered. You chose. The hat didn't force anything. No, Harry said. But hearing it from him, it's different. It's like he struggled for words. It's like permission. Hermione's voice was gentle. Ron looked at Harry for a long moment, then said awkwardly but sincerely, You don't have to worry about being like him, not the bad parts. You're you. Harry felt something warm settle in his chest. He nodded, because he couldn't trust his voice fully. Hermione shifted again, adjusting herself deeper into the chair, like a cat finding the best position. Do you know what else I keep thinking? Ron's expression warned of a lecture. If it's about conduits, it's not, Hermione said surprisingly. It's about what Hufflepuff said. That warmth you found tonight is what endures. Ron blinked. She said that? Hermione nodded. Not exactly those words, but that was the meaning. Harry's gaze moved to Ron, then Hermione. Their faces looked softer in the firelight, edges blurred by tiredness. He realized suddenly that this might be one of those nights he'd remember forever, not only because of founders and storm magic and rare portraits, but because of the way it felt to be safe with them. He didn't say it aloud. He didn't need to. The feeling settled into the silence, like a quiet agreement. The common room clock chimed a late hour. Harry didn't look to see which. It wasn't midnight anymore. The night had begun to slide toward morning without anyone noticing. Ron yawned, long and unrestrained, then tried to pretend he hadn't. I'm fine, he announced immediately. Hermione gave him a look. You're falling asleep sitting up. Ron blinked slowly. No, I'm not. Harry smiled faintly. Yes, you are. Ron tried to sit straighter and failed. His head tipped slightly, then corrected itself with stubborn will. I'm just resting my eyes. Hermione's voice softened. Maybe we should actually sleep. Even if it's down here. Ron opened his mouth to protest, then closed it as if he couldn't find the energy. Fine, he muttered, but I'm not moving. Hermione didn't argue. She simply gathered her blanket more tightly and leaned back, eyelids lowering. Harry hesitated. The sensible part of him knew he should go upstairs to his bed. He would feel it in his neck later if he slept in this chair. He would regret it when morning came. But the common room felt like the right place to be. It held the memory of the night. It held warmth. It held the quiet hum of Hogwarts settling. So Harry stayed. He shifted slightly, pulling part of the blanket across his legs. The chair embraced him in its worn, familiar way. The fire had burned down a little, but it was steady, glowing softly. The air remained warm enough near the hearth, while the corners of the room held a deeper chill, like winter waiting politely at the edges. Harry watched the embers for a while, thoughts drifting in and out. He pictured the lake under snow, the forest faintly lit, the house symbols drawn on the grounds. He pictured the founders' faces, their voices, the weight of their words. Eventually his thoughts began to loosen. The edges of the room blurred. The portraits became still shapes. The firelight turned into gentle warmth behind his eyelids. At some point, Harry became aware of nothing except the sense of being held by the chair, by the room, by the castle itself, and then he slept. When he woke, it was not because of a loud sound or a sudden interruption. It was because the light had changed. For a moment, Harry didn't know where he was. His neck ached faintly, and his legs felt heavy, as though something had been draped over them. He blinked, trying to gather his thoughts. The common room. He was in the armchair by the fire. The fire had burned down to embers, a soft glow in the hearth. The room was quiet in a way it never was during the day. Grey light filtered through the windows, dim but unmistakable. Dawn. Harry sat up slowly, careful not to move too quickly. The blanket slid off his knees and pooled around his lap. Ron was still asleep in the chair beside him, head tilted back at an angle that was going to cause pain later. His mouth was slightly open, his face relaxed in a way that looked younger than usual. Hermione had curled into her chair with her blanket wrapped around her like a cocoon, one hand resting on her book, even though she clearly hadn't read it for hours. Crookshanks lay on the hearthrug, stretched in a patch of lingering warmth, looking deeply content. The common room at dawn felt like a different world. The air was cooler now, without the full fire, but it was not uncomfortable. It felt fresh, calm. Still, Harry stood carefully, wincing slightly as his muscles complained, and walked to the window. The curtains had slipped partly closed during the night. He pulled them back. What he saw made his breath catch. The storm had passed. The sky was clearing from east to west, bands of grey cloud giving way to pale blue. The sun had not yet risen fully above the mountains, but its approach painted the horizon with a growing wash of gold. And the world below was transformed. Snow covered everything in deep, pristine layers, as if the storm had tucked the grounds under a smooth, white blanket. The familiar paths were nearly invisible. Trees stood heavy with snow, branches bowed. The lake was a pale expanse, frozen and hidden under white. The castle itself looked changed. Every ledge and tower and stone outcropping held snow-like decoration. The architecture was softened, reimagined, made almost gentle by winter's touch. But it was the quality of the light that held Harry's attention. As dawn approached, the snow did more than reflect the pale morning. It sparkled with something else, a faint, lingering magic, the remnant of the night's strange display. Each drift seemed scattered with tiny points of brightness, as if stars had been pressed into the landscape. Harry stood there, stunned, letting the sight settle inside him. A movement behind him made him glance back. Ron had woken. He stood slowly, rubbing his eyes, blanket still draped over his shoulders like a cloak. He followed Harry's gaze to the window and froze. Merlin's beard, Ron said, voice thick with sleep. That's beautiful. Harry nodded, unable to form a proper reply at first. We fell asleep, he said eventually, as if stating something important. Ron stared at the snow-covered world. Must have been after we got back. Hermione made a small sound from her chair, the kind of protest people make when they're pulled out of deep sleep. Then she sat up abruptly, hair even more unruly than usual, eyes blinking rapidly as she tried to focus. "What time is it?" she asked. "Early," Ron said, still staring at the view. "Sun's not even up properly." Hermione stood and stumbled slightly, blanket slipping. She caught it, pulled it around herself, and joined them at the window. The moment she saw the landscape, her expression changed from sleepy confusion to wonder so sharp it was almost painful. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, that's extraordinary." They stood in a row, three friends wrapped in blankets, watching dawn color the snow in pale gold and soft pink and the faintest hint of blue. Harry felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness. Not because everything was perfect in the world, he knew it wasn't, but because this moment was. This quiet, early morning, this view, these people beside him. "I'm glad we stayed up," Hermione said quietly. Ron snorted gently, "Even though we broke curfew." Hermione's mouth twitched. "Some rules are worth breaking for the right reasons." She paused, then added quickly, "Practical as ever. Don't ever tell Percy I said that." Harry let out a quiet laugh. "Your secret's safe with us." The sun continued its slow climb. As the light strengthened, details emerged more clearly. Snowdrifts had piled against castle walls in places, tall and deep. The grounds looked almost impassable beyond the cleared main courtyard. It was impossible to imagine students trudging to greenhouses or Hagrid's hut through that depth. Ron's eyes gleamed with certainty. Classes are cancelled. Hermione's instinctive response was to calculate. McGonagall will make an announcement at breakfast, she said, assuming the house elves can manage. The kitchens might be working overtime. Harry watched the light spill over the grounds and felt his tiredness shift into a strange kind of energy. Not physical energy, but emotional clarity, the kind that came after something rare. Last night had not changed the practical facts of his life. Voldemort was still out there. Danger still existed. Problems still waited. But something inside him had changed anyway. He had been reminded that he belonged. That Hogwarts could be more than a battleground or a place to learn spells. It could be shelter. It could be home. And as he stood with Ron and Hermione watching the snow glitter under growing daylight, Harry held on to that feeling as tightly as he could, because he knew it would matter later when the world demanded courage again. The quiet of dawn could never last long in Gryffindor Tower. Hogwarts woke the way it always did, gradually at first, then all at once, like a tide coming in. But for a few more minutes, Harry, Ron, and Hermione stayed by the window, wrapped in blankets, watching the light thicken over the snow outside. The castle grounds looked unreal in full morning clarity. The smooth white drifts softened every familiar shape until it all resembled an illustration in a storybook. Even the towers and ramparts of Hogwarts, stone and sharp angles, looked gentler with snow piled on every ledge like icing. Ron let out a slow breath, still half asleep. I'm never going to stop thinking about last night. Hermione's eyes remained fixed on the view, but her voice was steady. Good. We shouldn't. Harry didn't speak. He simply watched the way the sunlight caught on the snow and made it sparkle with faint, lingering magic. It wasn't as strong as it had been at midnight when everything had felt charged, but it was still there if you knew how to look. A whisper of the castle's extraordinary night, lingering into morning like an aftertaste. As if answering Hermione's earlier worry about breakfast, a soft pop sounded near the table. They all turned. A house elf stood there, elderly, with drooping ears and a serious expression that softened the moment she saw them awake. She carried a tray laden with tea things and what looked like fresh scones, steam curling gently above them. "Good morning, young masters and miss," the elf squeaked, setting the tray down carefully. "Nipsey is bringing breakfast for the early risers." Hermione's face brightened immediately. She always greeted house elves warmly. "Thank you, Nipsey. Is everything all right? The storm didn't damage the kitchens?" Nipsey looked slightly offended by the suggestion, as though Hogwarts's kitchens were indestructible by definition. "Oh no, miss. Kitchens are deep inside. Very safe. But Nipsey and the others must clear snow from entrances, must keep fires burning strong, must prepare for many hungry students. Big day." Ron's stomach rumbled loudly as if it agreed. Nipsey's expression softened into pleasure. "It is good to be needed," she added. And then she vanished, with another quiet pop, leaving behind the scent of warm bread and tea. Ron stared at the tray as if it were a miracle. Scones. Hermione sat down carefully, blankets still around her shoulders. "Eat," she ordered, practical. "We haven't had proper food in hours." Harry took a scone and broke it open. Steam rose from the center, and the smell of butter and honey made his stomach tighten with hunger. He hadn't realized how little he'd eaten. Hot chocolate and biscuits in the middle of the night didn't count as a meal, not after everything. They settled back into their chairs, still wrapped in blankets, sipping tea and eating scones, while the common room remained quiet. It felt like they had stolen an extra pocket of time, an in-between space, where last night still existed, and the day hadn't fully arrived yet. Ron chewed thoughtfully, then swallowed and said, "We should probably clean up." Hermione blinked at him in surprise. "Did you just say that?" Ron shrugged, cheeks slightly pink. "If Percy comes down and sees the chess set and the mugs and the blankets everywhere, he'll make a speech." Harry smiled. "He'll make a list." Hermione took a sip of tea. "We can tidy in a minute." Ron nodded quickly, as if relieved she hadn't insisted immediately. In a minute. Harry understood the reluctance. Tidying meant ending the moment. It meant turning the night into something that had already happened, something finished. Sitting here with tea and scones, and the quiet view outside made it feel like the magic was still close enough to touch. The portrait hole swung open suddenly, sending a faint draft through the room. All three of them startled at once. Reflexes, too, trained by years of unexpected trouble. But it wasn't Filch. It wasn't Percy. Nearly headless Nick drifted through the wall beside the fireplace, silver and translucent, but unusually substantial in the early light. Ghosts were always more visible at dawn and dusk. Harry had noticed that before, though he'd never thought much about why. Nick's head wobbled slightly as he floated closer, expression bright with good humor. "The Midnight Wanderers are awake." End of poem. Hermione's posture went rigid for a heartbeat, as though she'd forgotten ghosts could be observant. Ron tried for nonchalance and failed. "We dozed off." Nick's eyes twinkled. "So I gathered. Quite a night, wasn't it?" "I've been checking on the state of the corridors after the storm. The Grey Lady says it was the strongest magical surge she's felt in decades." Hermione's eyes widened, fighting curiosity and caution at the same time. Nick drifted toward the window, peering out. "Beautiful morning after a wild night," he said. "That is often the way of it." Hermione chose her words carefully. "Nick, the founders' portraits. Do they often become more present during events like last night?" Nick turned slowly, his eyebrows lifting with real surprise. "The founders?" he repeated. Hermione's expression remained innocent in the way Hermione could manage when she was trying very hard. "Just in general." Nick studied them with the quiet sharpness of someone who had watched students for centuries. Then his expression softened into something like fond recognition. "You saw them," he said softly, "didn't you?" There was no point denying it. Not to Nick. He had been at Hogwarts long enough to sense when something extraordinary had brushed against the castle's routine. Harry nodded. "In the corridor behind the Barnabas tapestry." Ron swallowed. They were awake. Properly awake. Nick's translucent face shifted into awe. "Extraordinary," he breathed. "I have only seen them truly conscious perhaps 3 times in my centuries here. You 3 do have a habit of being in the right place at remarkable times." Hermione's voice was urgent. "Will they remember?" "They said they would. But ghosts forget nothing," Nick said gently, as though offering her comfort. "Portraits remember too, in their own way. They will remember, I am certain. And so will you." Ron shifted awkwardly. "They said friendship matters. That we should hold on to each other." Nick smiled, his head wobbling slightly. "Wise words," he said. "And perhaps not new wisdom, but wisdom that becomes deeper when spoken at the right moment." He drifted closer to the fireplace, hovering near the embers, though he could not feel warmth. "The castle will return to normal now," he continued. "The magic will settle back into its usual patterns. But nights like last night remind us what Hogwarts truly is, beneath lessons and rules." Harry swallowed. A living thing. Nick's eyes gleamed. Precisely. Ancient and powerful and capable of wonder. The sound of footsteps on the dormitory stairs reached them then, soft at first, then more. The castle waking. Students beginning to stir. Nick lifted his chin slightly as though listening. "And now the day begins," he said. "I have my own duties to attend. Enjoy your snow day, young ones. You have earned it." With that, he drifted away through a wall, leaving behind only the sense that he had confirmed something important, that last night had been real. For a few more minutes, the common room remained theirs. Then the first second years came down the stairs, sleepy faces turning instantly into delight when they saw the snow through the windows. "It's massive!" someone shouted. A small crowd formed almost immediately, pressing toward the glass, exclaiming, pointing, bouncing on their toes. The quiet pocket of dawn burst into lively chatter. More students followed. Third years, fourth years, even older students who normally wouldn't care that much about snow. The entire common room seemed to fill with a bright, infectious excitement. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stayed near their chairs, letting the chaos flow around them. To everyone else, this was simply a brilliant snow day. Cancelled lessons, snowball fights, the novelty of seeing Hogwarts transformed into winter. Only the three of them carried the deeper memory. The castle's midnight artistry, the charged air, the founders' voices speaking directly into their lives. Fred and George came thundering down the boys' staircase like they were late for something important. They took one look at the snow and immediately began speaking at the same time. "This," Fred declared, "is the greatest opportunity Hogwarts has ever given us." George nodded solemnly. "We will need strategy." "Teams," Fred added. "Fortifications," George said, eyes shining. "Perhaps some minor enhancements." "Absolutely not." Percy's voice cut through the excitement like a sharp bell. He appeared at the top of the stairs, hair slightly rumpled, looking like he'd slept less than he wanted anyone to know. "If you bewitch snowballs and someone gets hurt," Percy said, marching down with authority, "you will lose Gryffindor 100 points each." Fred put a hand to his chest. "Percy, you wound us." George sighed theatrically. "We were only thinking of morale." Percy glared. "Your morale can survive without enchanted projectiles." Ron leaned toward Harry and murmured, "He's going to be insufferable today." Hermione gave Ron a look that suggested she found Percy's concern far more reasonable than Ron did. As the room churned with plans, snowball fights, snow sculptures, daring walks to the grounds, Hermione finally stood, determination returning. "We should tidy," she said. Ron groaned, but he got up too, because he knew she was right. They worked quickly. Hermione waved her wand to send the blankets back to wherever she'd conjured them from. Ron scooped the chess pieces up, the little stone soldiers complaining loudly about being interrupted mid-war. "We were winning," a rook grumbled. "You were losing," Ron corrected. "We were regrouping," the rook snapped. Harry collected mugs and plates, stacking them neatly near the portrait hole where the house elves could retrieve them. Within minutes, there was no evidence that 3 students had spent the entire night here. It felt strange, erasing the physical proof, but Harry understood why Hermione wanted it gone. The memory belonged in their heads, not scattered across the common room for Percy to interrogate. Ron stretched and winced. "My neck is going to murder me." Hermione nodded briskly. "Go. Wash. Change. Then we meet back here for breakfast." Ron looked delighted by the idea of returning to his bed even briefly. "I'm going to sleep for 5 minutes." Hermione raised an eyebrow. You will sleep for an hour if you lie down. Ron shrugged. Worth it. They separated, heading toward their dormitories. Harry climbed the stairs to the boys' room and found most of his roommates still asleep. Curtains drawn, beds warm. He moved quietly, opening his trunk, pulling out clean robes. The castle's usual morning sounds filtered faintly through the tower. Voices, laughter, the muffled thud of students running up and down stairs in excitement. Before going to wash, Harry paused at his dormitory window. From this angle he could see the path toward Hagrid's hut, the edge of the forbidden forest, the slope of the grounds leading down toward the lake. Everything was white and brilliant in full daylight. The storm's aftermath looked like a new world. He thought again of the night, of the way Hogwarts had seemed to reveal itself, as if the castle had turned its face toward them and allowed them a rare glimpse of its true nature. He thought of the founders, of what they had said, of what it had meant to hear Slytherin speak about choice, of how Gryffindor's warmth had felt like approval rather than expectation. Then Harry turned away and went to wash, because the day was beginning whether he was ready or not. When he returned to the common room, dressed and awake as he could manage, the space had transformed into organized chaos. Nearly every Gryffindor in the tower seemed to be present, either preparing to go outside or already arguing about teams and tactics. Fred and George had commandeered a table and were sketching something that looked alarmingly like a battle plan. Younger students clustered around them, offering advice and suggestions that ranged from clever to ridiculous. We could build a snow fortress, a third year said, eyes bright. And we could lure Slytherins into a trap, another offered, far too gleefully. Hermione appeared at Harry's side with her hair pulled into a practical plait and her warmest cloak already on. I just saw the notice board, she said. McGonagall has cancelled all morning classes. We're to report to the Great Hall for announcements at 9. Ron arrived moments later wearing a thick maroon jumper that looked like something Mrs. Weasley would knit. He looked more awake than Harry did, which felt unfair. That gives us time, Ron said, calculating immediately. Breakfast, then snow. Hermione's lips twitched. Announcements first. They made their way to the portrait hole. The fat lady looked far more cheerful in daylight, her painted shawl replaced by something brighter. Mind the corridors, dears, she said as they climbed through. Still quite chilly. The elves are working wonders. But stone is stone. The corridor beyond was frigid, though not as brutally cold as midnight. Torches burned with normal warm flames now, no strange blue tint. The castle felt calmer in the daylight, but still alive with after-storm energy. Portraits were chattering openly about the weather. A proper blizzard, one called as they passed. Haven't seen one like that since 1532, Ron muttered. Everyone says that. Hermione whispered, it's because they really have. They descended the marble staircase toward the entrance hall. House elves hurried past carrying buckets of grit and salt. The great oak doors stood open, and Harry could see professors outside, clearing snow with methodical wandwork. Professor Flitwick stood on a conjured platform, directing snow into enormous piles. Professor Sprout was reinforcing a path toward the greenhouses, muttering fiercely about her plants. Even Snape was present, vanishing snow with sharp, irritated movements that suggested he took the storm personally. Ron glanced at him. Snape looks thrilled. Hermione murmured, he's probably annoyed the weather dared to inconvenience him. They entered the great hall, and warmth wrapped around them. The enchanted ceiling now showed a brilliant blue sky, with only a few wispy clouds. Sunlight pouring down as if the storm had never existed at all. The house tables were piled with food, more than usual, as if the house elves had decided warmth and abundance were the correct response to winter. Porridge, eggs, sausages, toast, pastries, fruit, steaming teapots and jugs of pumpkin juice. Harry realized again how hungry he was. He loaded his plate without hesitation. Around them, the hall filled rapidly. Every house buzzed with excitement about the snow. Hufflepuffs were already discussing whether the badger shape on the grounds could be preserved. Ravenclaws had books open beside their plates, debating the magical properties of snow as though it were an academic subject rather than a reason to throw snowballs. Slytherins looked amused in that reserved way that suggested they were pretending not to care, while absolutely caring. At precisely 9, Dumbledore rose. The hall fell silent. His presence did not need volume to command attention. His blue eyes swept the room, twinkling. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I trust everyone weathered the storm comfortably." A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. "Excellent. I have several announcements regarding today's altered schedule. First, all morning classes are cancelled to allow our staff to ensure the castle and grounds are safe and accessible." Cheers burst out, quickly tempered by stern looks from professors. "Afternoon classes will proceed as normal," Dumbledore continued, and groans followed, but not with real anger. Everyone had known the reprieve wouldn't last forever. "Second," Dumbledore said, "the grounds are open for recreation, with important restrictions. The Forbidden Forest remains strictly off-limits. The lake is frozen, but has not been tested for safety, so no one is to venture onto it." Ron sighed dramatically. "And while snowball fights are permitted," Dumbledore added, "any attempt to enhance snow projectiles with magic will result in immediate detention." Fred and George looked personally wounded. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled brighter. "Finally, I wish to acknowledge that last night's storm was more than severe weather. Those sensitive to such things may have noticed the castle's magic, responding to the conditions in unusual ways. This is normal, and nothing to be alarmed about. Hogwarts has weathered countless storms over its 1,000-year history, and will weather countless more." Harry felt Hermione stiffen beside him. The words seemed general, addressed to the hall, but Harry couldn't shake the feeling that Dumbledore knew. Not necessarily the founders. Not necessarily every detail. But that something had happened. "It is a testament to the founders' vision," Dumbledore continued, "that their creation not only endures, but thrives." Harry kept his face neutral. Ron stared very hard at his plate. Hermione's posture was rigidly composed. "Eat hearty," Dumbledore finished, voice warm. "Dress warmly. Enjoy this gift of a snow day. And do be back inside by the time afternoon classes begin." With that, the hall burst back into life. Students leapt up, talking, laughing, planning. The Weasley twins immediately began gathering supporters. Hufflepuffs spoke about snow sculptures. Ravenclaws discussed experiments. Slytherins smirked and formed their own groups. Professors leaned together, likely discussing how to stop half the school from freezing or setting something on fire. Hermione finished her tea and looked at Harry and Ron. "What do you want to do?" Harry considered. Part of him wanted the chaos, the laughter, the snow fights, the feeling of being a normal student for once. Another part wanted quiet. Wanted to hold on to last night's meaning a little longer. "Walk to the lake," he said, "just to look. The three of us." Ron nodded immediately. "Before everyone tramples it." Hermione smiled softly. "Perfect." They bundled up in the entrance hall, pulling on scarves and gloves, Hermione producing extra warm items from her bag with brisk efficiency. When they stepped outside, the cold hit them clean and sharp, but it felt invigorating now, rather than harsh. The morning air carried that bright winter clarity that made everything feel possible. They walked through snow that came up to their knees in places, leaving deep footprints behind them. Most students were still inside finishing breakfast or gathering for battles, so the grounds were quiet in this part. The castle rose behind them, majestic and ancient and undeniably alive. As they moved toward the lake, Harry felt the last of the night settle into something steady inside him. The storm had passed. The extraordinary had folded back into ordinary life. But the warmth, friendship, belonging, choice remained. And as they walked together across the white grounds, Harry thought that perhaps that was the truest magic Hogwarts ever offered. Not just spells, not just ancient walls, but the chance to find people who felt like home. And the choice to keep choosing them, day after day.